Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, Urbana Socialist Forum, or as we like to say on the televised version of this show, UPTV. These views are our own, and by our, in this instance, I mean myself, because it's just me again, as it so often is. And I'm back to talk about, immigration. That's what I talk about on this show. It's not always strictly immigration, but it's usually mostly immigration. Politics enters in because you can't talk about immigration. Immigration is a political issue. These days, anyway. It has been for a long time. There may have been times when it wasn't, or at least wasn't so much of one. It was more of a social issue. But now it's pretty much a political issue. And way down on the scale of things that people care about, it's a social issue, and it's a cultural issue, and it's all sorts of different things like that. It's been difficult for a while to do this show. Excuse me while I try to fix something here. Let me start that again. It's been difficult, really basically since the election, to do this show because there's either something new seemingly going on like every other day, or nothing's really happening for a while, and it goes back and forth. So there are these moments of like, oh no, it's, the sky is about to fall in, and then it doesn't really fall in, and so there's kind of this sense of like, oh well, it didn't turn out to be as bad, and then it just kind of creeps downhill from there. It's almost as if he says, as if someone is like actually contriving these situations so that they frighten you and keep everybody stirred up, but then the movement on making the bad things happen isn't actually swift enough that it's not as shocking. The movement is not as shocking as your anticipation of the possibilities. And I think in a way it's actually, I don't want to say a smart technique because that gives it sort of a positive spin, but it's a very successful technique because it allows the party in power, the administration in power, to do two things: appease its extremist elements of its base, I guess you'd call it, and keep the other side off guard and unbalanced at all times. So it's a pretty successful thing. It isn't a good thing in any possible stretch of anyone's imagination, but it is a successful technique for creating havoc and making it difficult to fight back. Because what are you fighting against? Are you fighting against the extreme pronouncements or the slightly less extreme but very troublesome developments that you see, which are headed towards the extreme, but they never quite keep up with the pronouncements to the point where you can say, look at how horrible this thing is that we were told was going to happen, and then it did. It's more like, look what this horrible thing that we're being told is going to happen, and look at these horrible things that are going on, which aren't quite as horrible as what we were told would happen, but are far worse than they ever should be, and that anyone ever, hopefully, probably ever thought they were going to be. So it's a really interesting time if you can step back from the reality and the actual human damage that's being done and just think about it intellectually, stroke your little professorial goatee and go, well, that's very interesting communications technique, disruption technique. But it does bring up an issue that I think it would be interesting to look at, and that's what I'm going to try and do on this show, is just look at the difference between credulity and duplicity. And by this I mean the people in power that are making the decisions, the people whose support is providing, justification for the people in power, say, well, these people want me to do that. These voters elected me, and that's what I'm going to do. There are varying degrees of both credulity and duplicity within that group. By which I mean there are people that actually just believe all these things that aren't true. Immigrants are pouring over the borders. Our borders are like wide open. Immigrants are just pouring in, and they're bringing drugs, they're committing crimes, they're doing all sorts of horrible things, and no one is doing anything to stop them. That's on the one hand. They're taking away your jobs. They're soaking up the public service dollars that exist to help hardworking Americans who aren't being helped. I mean, how many times have you opened up your little Facebook account and had that kind of creepy person from high school, or the weird uncle who posts the thing about, homeless veterans are on the streets. Meanwhile, immigrants are, getting housing and food stamps. It's not fair. That kind of contrast, as if literally immigrants are coming in and they just walk to the front of the line and they say, hey, we want all the goodies, and the government's going, sure, you can have them. There are worthy, hardworking citizens who are supposed to get these, who aren't, but hey, Obama said you were okay, so we're going to give them to you instead, and because eventually you'll vote for Democrats, or some sort of nonsense. I don't know actually how they think about this stuff, but that's the effect of it. That's the picture that is being painted, and that there are a lot of people, very poorly informed people, very bigoted, often very racist people, who believe this stuff because it supports their bigotry and racism, and because it just fits with the world picture that they're being fed by the people in power. Now, then you get to the people in power. Some of them surely are educated enough and intelligent enough to know that this stuff is not true. Some of them, on the other hand, maybe actually do believe it, or they want to believe it so much that they're willing to kind of overlook the evidence to the contrary, because someone was able to cherry pick just enough details that make them go, well, yeah, see, I'm right. Immigrants are murdering people, and they are taking jobs. I don't know where people fall along this spectrum, and it's a constant question that I have. I've raised it many times in the past, although I never really framed it exactly like this, but I have wondered who is saying these things and acting on these assumptions because they actually believe it, and who is doing it because it is useful for them to pretend to believe it. And there are reasons that this makes a difference. Now, the outcome ends up being the same. So the effects of somebody either thinking it because they don't know any better, or pretending to think it and knowing perfectly well that it's not true, the end result is exactly the same, but how you fight against that would be different. If someone really doesn't understand, and they're really believing a lot of things that aren't true, then you can educate them. And then presumably they'll go, oh, I had no idea. Well, therefore I will change my opinion. Maybe not, maybe so, who knows, but at least there is a possibility of changing it. Whereas if someone is pretending to believe this stuff, educating them is pointless because they already know better. They already know it's not true, and therefore they are prepared to fight against your attempts to educate them because they don't want that truth to get out there. And so they try to bury that with misdirection, with misinformation, and just basically shout you down so that no one can hear you. So how we as activists, as people who care about these things, spend our time, what we put our energies into, it's important to examine that, the way our time is spent, the way our energy is spent, and consider, are we wasting information on people that already know it and don't want to admit it and don't want to hear it? Or are we possibly educating someone that really needs to hear it? So it really does matter to us more than it matters to them, and more than it matters in the grand scheme of things in terms of like what the result of that either stupidity or malice, whichever it is, whichever extreme on the end of that scale it is, kind of doesn't matter in terms of what they're going to do and how they do it. So I've got together a collection of different stories that kind of highlight certain aspects of this question and make you think about how one could deal with these things based on wondering or based on some sort of understanding that this person either has no idea what they're talking about, or they do and it doesn't matter because they're doing this for another reason. So the first one is an example of, here's basically what happens when you create policies based on misinformation. So this is from a website called Talking Points Memo. It's an article entitled "Trump Admin Poised to Give Rural Whites a Carve-Out on Medicaid Work Rules." So this is not exactly information, but this is just what happens when you're operating on information that isn't true. It's kind of weird to call it information when it's not true. When you're operating on beliefs that are not true. In this case, the belief is that there are a lot of people taking advantage of government services who don't deserve or need them. They're just misusing the system. And so this is an attempt to fix that problem. In this case, it's Medicaid, and they want to have work requirements that go with receiving Medicaid. So they're basically saying, well, you could be working, but you're not. You're just sitting here taking government money, and therefore we will require you to work if you can, and therefore, you know, we won't be giving you so much money, or you won't be needing as much money because you're working. So anyway, I'll read the story and then we can talk about the details later. So as the Trump administration moves aggressively to allow more states to impose mandatory work requirements on their Medicaid programs, several states have come under fire for crafting policies that would in practice shield many rural white residents from the impact of the new rules. Sorry, I'm allergic. There's something in this room. Every time I come in here, I almost immediately start sneezing and blowing my nose and things like that. It's very annoying. So I apologize if I'm sniffing in your ear or if I have to stop and sneeze every now and then. So in the GOP-controlled states of Kentucky, Michigan, and Ohio, waiver proposals would subject hundreds of thousands of Medicaid enrollees to work requirements, threatening to cut off their health insurance if they can't meet an hours per week threshold. Those waivers include exemptions for the counties with the highest unemployment, which tend to be majority white, GOP-leaning, and rural. But many low-income people of color who live in high unemployment urban centers would not qualify because the wealthier suburbs surrounding those cities pull the overall county unemployment rate below the threshold. Quote, "This is a sort of version of racial redlining where they're identifying communities where the work requirements will be in full effect and others where they will be left out," George Washington University health law professor Sarah Rosenbaum told TPM. When that starts to result in racially identifiable areas, that's where the concern increases. Rosenbaum and other health law experts say the waivers already approved for Kentucky, pending for Ohio, and advancing in Michigan's legislature may run afoul of Title VI of Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits race-based discrimination in federal assistance programs. Under that statute, even policies that are racially neutral on their face but have a disparate impact on a particular group could be illegal. The waiver in Kentucky, the first state to win federal approval for a Medicaid working requirement, will have the effect of exempting 8 southeastern counties where the percentage of white residents is over 90%. The work requirements will be imposed first in northern Kentucky, which includes Jefferson, the county with the highest concentration of black residents in the state. The rules are set to be enforced first in that area this July, but a federal court challenge in June could decide the fate of the program. In Michigan, the GOP-controlled legislature is trying to pass a bill to make the 700,000 people enrolled in the state's Medicaid expansion either work at least 29 hours per week or lose their benefits for a year. According to the state's own numbers, 105,000 people could lose their insurance, but that burden will not be shared equally across the state. People who live in counties with unemployment rates above 8.5% would be exempt, and those counties are overwhelmingly white, rural, and vote Republican. But low-income residents of color, I'm getting messages here, low-income residents of color in Detroit and Flint, where the joblessness and poverty are extremely high, would not receive an exemption. A Washington Post analysis found that while African Americans make up about 23% of Medicaid enrollees in Michigan, they would make up just 1.2% of the people eligible for an exemption. Meanwhile, 57% of Michigan Medicaid enrollees are white, but white residents would make up 85% of the population eligible for an exemption. Excuse me. Ohio's Medicaid work requirement proposal, recently submitted for federal approval, is of similar design and would have the same disparities between urban residents of color in Cleveland and Columbus and rural white residents in the rest of the state. John Corlett, Ohio's former Medicaid director and the president of Cleveland's Center for Community Solutions, studied the 26 counties that qualify for an exemption from the proposed Medicaid work requirements and found they are, on average, 94% white. Meanwhile, his research found most of these non-exempted Ohio communities have either majority or significant African American populations. The communities most at risk under this scenario are African American, and those communities already have significantly higher rates of infant mortality, lower life expectancy, and a number of other serious health disparities, he told TPM. Additionally, Corlett noted, the racial divides within and among counties across the U.S. are a product of decades of racist policies, and designing the exemptions on a county-by-county basis only serves to lock in those divides. Quote, our housing patterns in Ohio are influenced by a past history of institutionalized segregation, and the Medicaid waiver reinforces that instead of mitigating it, he said. Ohio could help mitigate the racial discriminatory impact of the waiver by exempting smaller units of government like municipalities. Ohio submitted its waiver to HHS the first week of May, and the policy is now under active consideration. Michigan's still needs approval from the governor, but the GOP legislature is pressuring him to sign it, even threatening to cut state officials' salaries if he fails to do so. Leonardo Coelho, with the National Health Law Program, one of the groups bringing the federal lawsuit on behalf of Kentucky residents, told TPM that while the exemptions in these states are aimed at addressing a genuine problem, the lack of work opportunities in many areas, they are impossible to extricate from the racialized national conversation about federal assistance in work. Quote, we're talking about a policy based on stereotypes about Medicaid enrollees, Coelho added, pointing to research that most non-elderly, non-disabled Medicaid recipients already work. There's a constant dog whistle in the background here about making lazy people get off their couches and go to work, and playing into stereotypes about African Americans. It's almost impossible to argue that the policy is not racial. Complicating the arguments playing out in several states over carve-outs for certain Medicaid recipients is the Trump administration's ongoing internal battles over exemption for Native Americans. As some HHS employees continue to insist that exempting tribal citizens from the work requirements would be an illegal racial preference, legal experts and members of Congress warn that imposing the requirements on tribal communities violates their sovereignty. Okay, sorry, I'm snuffling a lot here. I just love allergies. Anyway, so there's a number of points in here, but if you were listening closely, you caught that. First, let's talk about the bigger picture. The bigger picture is government assistance. Medicaid is a medical government assistance program. So there is a lot of belief that exists out there that too many people are getting assistance. There are too many people who don't need it, who shouldn't be getting it, who are getting it somehow for some reason. This exists about food stamps. This exists about Medicaid. It exists about any number of programs that the government has for helping people in need. There's always a push back against these programs in saying that it shouldn't be going to so many people. They're too expensive, they're too costly, and they're going to people that don't need them. So first of all, how do we establish who does and does not need these programs? Well, oddly enough, when you sign up for these programs, that's the point at which they examine your situation, your medical history, your work history, your finances, all these different things, and decide that you are eligible. So it's not as if they just put a sign out saying, okay, we're going to take 100 people today on this program. First come, first serve. Whoever signs up first gets it. There's nothing like that going on. It is each program, every one of these programs, each one of them has a lengthy list of requirements that you have to go through in order to become eligible for the program. So somebody is already doing that work. But it is helpful for people who want to complain about, say, high taxes, for example. They have to say why taxes shouldn't be so high. So when, the tax bill goes out, they say, well, look at this. They're taking money for this. They're taking money for that. They're taking money for this other thing. You shouldn't have to be paying that money. That's your money. They're just taking your money away and giving it to other people. Now, if the assumption is that these programs are run by relatively honest people who are indeed following the rules and making sure that everybody who is enrolled on the programs is actually deserving of them, then there's no argument to be made there. It's like, well, these people are in need of help, and we're helping them, and that's where this part of your tax money goes to. So in order to explain why people should be getting more of their tax money back, you have to explain why these programs are wasteful, why they're not doing what they are supposed to do. And that's where a lot of this comes from. That is a political ploy that feeds into public stereotypes, racist stereotypes, impressions that people have about people. So if you've created this notion, for example, which they talk about later on, where like black people are lazy and are just soaking up public assistance, they don't work, they just hang out all day, and then they go down and get their welfare check, and then their Medicaid check, and then their food stamps and all this stuff. I mean, this notion that a lot of people have, which is based in some instances around their perceptions. Because if you have, for example, as it's noted here, you've had cities that have concentrated people of poverty, often people of color, in certain areas, then you're going to have these areas where a lot of people who are in the same situation all live together. They're not spread out around the city, the state, in the suburbs, out in the country. They are concentrated together, and that was done intentionally. That was part of segregation, was to keep people together, to keep poor people, to keep people of color out of these white neighborhoods that didn't want them in there. So right off the bat, you have a situation where if you don't think critically, you're just driving around, going through your day, not really thinking about things, you'll notice that people in certain parts of town all seem to be prosperous and doing pretty well. People in other parts of town all seem to be poor and doing very badly. You'll notice that the prosperous people tend to be white more often than not. You will notice that the people of color tend to be poor more often than not. Why is this? Is that because white people are harder working and more industrious and therefore they come up with more money? No, it is because the people, because of the kinds of laws and zoning and whatnot that have been done over the years, have pushed all the people that were kind of extra and unwanted in this area into a certain part of town and kind of isolated them there and kept them there, made it very, very difficult for them to get out. Sure, it's possible. There's no law saying if you are poor and black, you must live here. But if you are poor, you can only afford certain kind of housing, which is only available in a certain spot. And if you're black, you may be denied credit. You may be denied the ability to rent in certain places. You may be denied the opportunity to get a job in certain places. So where are you going to go? You're going to go where the only place you are allowed to go or you are encouraged to go, which is in this one part of town. So that's where some of these people, just regular folks who are just driving around, get these impressions. That's where a lot of these stereotypes start being built because, one, they're hearing it from people, politicians, who are trying to make excuses for why they want to enact certain policies that reflect their prejudices and their, personal preferences. And two, you're going to see living examples of what you thought was the case. All these wealthy, or at least, regularly well-to-do people live over here, and they're mostly white. And all these poor people live over there, and they're mostly not. And that's where a lot of this stuff comes from. So it forms a feedback loop between these groups, the people that want to manipulate for their purposes and the people who are manipulated. The belief and the explanations and the stories and the code messaging and the dog whistles, as it's described in here, coming from the other end, they reinforce each other until you have what is considered common knowledge amongst certain people, that it is just well known that these people are okay, these people are not. These people are safe, these people aren't. And on and on and on. So that's where a lot of this stuff comes from. That's how, for example, these laws in these states are being promoted, and the effect is going to be, we are intentionally, I would say, now this, here I'm stepping out on a limb and going beyond saying, it seems like, I am saying, I really believe that the people creating and crafting these laws know exactly what they're doing.